everyone, we're going to get started. Welcome. My name is Allison Korn. I'm the Assistant Dean for Experiential Education at UCLA School of Law. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the fourth session of our Teaching Justice webinar series. Today, the topic is Teaching Racial Justice, and it is presented by Jyoti Nanda, who is my colleague here at UCLA for a short time longer, and will be an assistant professor at Golden Gate University School of Law this fall. We're also joined by presenter Mary Yanik, who teaches the immigration practicum at Tulane University School of Law, and is also senior staff attorney at the New Orleans Workers Center for Racial Justice. We want to let you know that this session is going to be recorded. We will make it available on the CLEA website, and we'll circulate that information and link after the session concludes. On that web link, you'll also have access to our previous sessions, so we encourage you to view it and also share among your networks. The presenters today welcome your questions during and after the session. If you have a question during the session, please use the chat function. That's located at the bottom of your screen, and you have the option to send your question to either me, Allison Korn, or Layla Halas, and we will make sure to get them and funnel them appropriately to our presenters. We will be able to take questions during, to the extent they're able to pause, but also we'll make sure to leave some room at the end for some Q&A among everybody. Finally, we do ask everyone to please mute their microphones and turn off their video functions for the remainder of the session. As Layla mentioned earlier, we will have more of a straightforward webinar format, and so this will allow our presenters to take center stage. I'm going to turn it over to Layla for a few remarks.
Welcome everyone, I'm Layla Halas. I'm the Director of Experiential Learning here at Tulane, and I'm the co-chair of the Best Practices Committee of CLEA. And this webinar series, Teaching Justice, is a project of CLEA's Best Practices Committee. As part of this project, we've been drawing on a number of innovative faculty members to teach us about new approaches in thinking about justice in the classroom. So each session draws on the wisdom of the current resistance movement and examines its intersection with a variety of topics such as economic justice, criminal justice, immigration justice, and of course today's topic, racial justice. We plan to continue this series into the next academic year, so please continue to check the Law Clinic, LexTurn, Clinicians of Color, and other listservs, as we'll be posting that information there as well as on the CLEA website with our upcoming sessions for the year. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand this presentation over to our presenters. Thanks so much.
Hi everybody, good afternoon. My name is Jyoti, and Mary Yanik is going to go right after me. We thought we would start today's conversation with introductions about ourselves, but what I really want to focus on in the introduction is, because I've been teaching for a very long time, the different ways in which I've thought about introducing race in various types of teaching, because I want to sort of make sure that this presentation maximizes on everybody's ability to do this depending on what they teach and where they teach. So I'm going to sort of go through the different courses I've taught and kind of highlight for you what types of classes I've taught and where this issue has been on my mind for the last 16 years. So I've taught first-year courses in the public interest law program here at UCLA. That includes lawyering skills that I taught for 13 years to both students in the public interest law program and a wide swath of students. I've taught introduction to public interest law, problem solving in public interest law. I've taught a variety of different clinics. I started my own clinic 5 years ago, which is the Youth and Justice Clinic. You can see here on the screen the types of cases that I did. But I also taught, helped roll out for the entire law school a first-year class on introduction to lawyer-client relationship. And that class was very interesting because we were tasked with thinking about how to introduce the subject of introducing students to clients, first-year students to clients, and I was tasked with trying to think about how we introduce race and culture and difference. And so I combed the entire country, looked at all the resources, and have been thinking through a lot about that and tried various things that I think worked and didn't work that we'll talk about later. As I mentioned, my clinic class, which is probably where this issue is most salient, given the intensity of the type of work we do. LA County has the largest juvenile facilities in the country, so it's very intense work, and that has been something I've really thought a lot about. And then this last year, I taught criminal law to first-year students, to 77 students. And again, the issues of race, of course, are prevalent in everything that we do and think about in law. Particularly on the doctrinal courses, though, I spent a lot of time thinking about how race plays into inferences, specifically regarding demonstrating intent, when you're thinking about intent. Of course, it came up in every case, as you can imagine, but where I really spent some time focusing on it was, of course, around my cases related to stand your ground, and then, of course, around rape and sexual assault. I also took my students to Men's Central Jail, all 77 of them this year. And of course, there are issues, you know, in LA County, given the population and given that the majority of the people inside are Black and brown, it was a natural issue that came up. And now lastly, I'm on the American Bar Association Juvenile Justice Task Force, and we're tasked with rewriting or updating the standards for the country. And so it's coming up now on like a more national policy level and how to think about it. So that just sort of gives you an overview of me, and I wanted to sort of share that so that if people have questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. Thank you.
And then my name is Yanik. I'm a much newer clinician. I've been teaching the Immigrants' Rights Practicum with Layla Lass for the past 2 years at Tulane Law School. It's a course that's semester long, where we pair 8 students to take 4 cases and supervise them. Crimes, and those are cases that are taken through the organization that I work for, and we focus specifically on law and organizing, which is my practice and my full-time job. And the students that take the course at Tulane, of course, are signing up for Immigrant Rights Practicum course. They're very interested in supporting immigrant rights, but are sometimes newer to some of the racial justice topics that we talk about. And so we talk about in the class how difficult it is to talk about this in a law school classroom and the importance of it. So I wanted to share that experience. And of course, in this context, the majority of students are not sharing the identity of the clients, who are Latinx, Spanish-speaking immigrant members of the community. So there's also that dynamic present there. Additionally, I wanted to share the experience from the New Orleans Worker Center for Racial Justice, where I work. It's a very unique organization. I'm one of 2 lawyers in our legal department, and we have a law and organizing practice, which means that all of our legal work is in support of organizers. The majority of the organization is composed of organizers that are leading campaigns that are led by our membership, directly affected communities of color fighting for immigrant, racial, and economic justice. So through that practice, we also have a summer internship program where we have 4 summer law clerks come for a 10-week period. That attracts folks who are specifically coming to us for this law and organizing experience, for the experience of learning from directly affected people, from learning from our member leaders. And so those law clerks come specifically also for our racial justice politics. We're a unique worker center in that we have membership both in the Black New Orleanian community fighting for economic justice and against criminalization, as well as in the immigrant community fighting against immigration enforcement and in support of workers' rights. So in that program, we still run a clinic-like seminar, a department meeting, and we pair each law clerk with organizers on a campaign, and they work on legal advising individual cases, policy and legal research release, spanning the gamut. But both of these reflective practices have been spaces for me to explore this issue, and part of what we're excited to talk to you about today.
So we figured if you're dialing in today or watching this webinar at some point, this is a moot point for you because you obviously think that racial justice is important in the clinic, but we thought we'd take a minute or two just to talk about why we think in this moment this issue is particularly salient. I mean, it goes without saying, given what's happening in our world today and in politics, that it's a particularly difficult moment in, I think, our nation's history and in our democracy to talk about this issue. I just wanted to, given sort of the footage of children and immigrants that has been all over social media the last like 24 hours in particular, I just wanted to acknowledge how difficult and challenging and emotional talking about these issues can be, and that even though this is not a self-care webinar, that should sort of be a companion to talking about this issue. Obviously, the climate and the politics demand that we talk about this. Most recently, the Ninth Circuit argument of the DOJ lawyer, representing the government's position on providing resources to children who are detainees, created quite a fodder for those of you that are Twitter followers about legal education, at least in my Twitter feed, and how law really just sort of teaches students to think both sides, devoid of emotion, devoid of feeling, devoid of moral obligation, which made me really think about how important these type of webinars and our training is for law professors and law clinicians, because I do think that there is a valid critique to be made about the way traditional legal education is taught, and you're seeing it sort of play out now in sort of on this stage. I also wanted to point out, at least specifically for me, given that my area of expertise is juvenile justice, that with the sort of success of Central Park 5, the Anna DuVernay film, which has been wildly successful, it's been phenomenal for me to hear responses from lay people, people in my family, people in my community, and sort of the shock that they have. And it's difficult, I'm sure, for many of you that do this work. The shock is sort of hard to take in sometimes because you're in it every day and day, and you're feeling like this is my everyday. This is how it's always been. This is how it's been since the beginning of this country. But so I feel like this moment is important because we want to encourage our students to sort of be angry, stay motivated, but without sort of becoming cynical, to sort of say this is how it's always been, this is how it's always going to be. And I think that that's really going to be a challenge for this moment going forward. I know it's a challenge that I'm constantly feeling. And the last thing I'm going to say is, the Batson case came down. Apparently, I have not had a chance to read the dissent, but Thomas's dissent really addresses race. I've heard that from a number of judges. Of course, Sotomayor has been commenting on it this term. And the citizenship question, which the decision was supposed to come out today, I think it's going to come out tomorrow, I think are going to be all sort of some SCOTUS cases as well that I think give us an opportunity to really address this issue in a meaningful way.
Absolutely, I echo all of those thoughts, and just to add that I think, in particular with all of those news points, and as well as just the constant cycle, I think what we're seeing is both clients and students are facing this like constant influx of really brazen and emboldened white supremacy, as well as other forms of discrimination. And that is causing a collective racial re-traumatization. It's certainly something we see here in the Deep South as a place that has deep experience in this. And it's something that I also draw a lot of wisdom from our members who founded our organization in the aftermath of Katrina, and at the height of a moral crisis. And so we see an absolute need to be talking about this in our clinic spaces, as well as I would just say, also along the lines of this work has been continuing and has been going on for a long time. I think there's also a unique opportunity in this moment because so much of the fight back has to address the racial undertones, or at sometimes overtones, and is creating a way to really expand the conversation and bring more people into these movements. And then I also wanted to share just that while there's a lot of very difficult legal news, and certainly I think a lot of us are very cynical about the Supreme Court right now, I think it's also important to have some sense of hope that some parts of the conversation in the courts are becoming more nuanced. So this is an excerpt that I share with students often and use as a jumping off point for discussion. Justice Sotomayor's dissent in Chouette. and I'm sure many folks have read this, but I think especially just the final paragraph is very moving. She says, and race matters for reasons that really are only skin deep, that cannot be discussed in any other way, and that cannot be wished away. Race matters to a young man's view of society when he spends his teenage years watching others tense up as he passes, no matter the neighborhood where he grew up. Race matters to a young woman's sense of self when she states her hometown and then is pressed, no, where are you really from, regardless of how many generations her family has been in the country. Race matters to a young person addressed by a stranger in a foreign language, which he does not understand because only English was spoken at home. Race matters because of the slights, the snickers, the silent judgments that reinforce the most crippling of thoughts. I do not belong here. I think this presents that there is an opportunity, both in our practice and in our clinics, to be advancing this analysis, both in the cases that we're bringing and the work that we're doing, as well as with students, that there are adjudicators that are being trained on implicit bias that are having these conversations. And so it's something that we all need to move our work forward as well. So next we just wanted to jump straight into some of what we've been doing and share examples and sort of lessons learned from things that we've tried in our different experiences, starting off with the first class. I think that for both of us, we do think it's important to raise it in the first class. In the immigrant rights practicum that I teach, we're working with clients who are member leaders of the New Orleans Worker Center for Racial Justice. So one of the ways that I frame this is just by talking about the importance of this for our clients and how they have this racial justice analysis, and this is an opportunity to tell their stories. And so I think that it's important to raise it in the first class because we see this as a time to sort of open the conversation and set a tone for the remainder of both the seminar and the clinic supervision spaces. We try to affirmatively state it up front so that people know it's something that we'll be talking about in all of these spaces, and start getting people comfortable with the idea that this is like part and parcel of doing the work and needs to be front and center. In our first class, we do a couple of things to try to frame the conversation in a way that will create a really reflective discussion. At the very beginning of our class, we start off with introductions to get to know each other and to ground each other, and we invite all students to share their own background, a family story, or depending on what they find relevant to share. Many students share their heritage and other just histories of their backgrounds, and I frame that as an opportunity for us to get to know each other as a class and start building that community, as well as to ground ourselves in our own histories, as we're also going to be learning and telling the stories of our clients. And then we also have a reading. In the past year, we used actually a video clip of Jerry Kang's Immaculate Conception piece to talk about implicit bias and start to have just a brief conversation about this issue at the very forefront of the class. This year, we used Mari Matsuda's When the First Quail Calls, and I really love that piece. I think that it's been mentioned on a past webinar in this series, so thanks to Anilai and Samir Asher for mentioning it. But it's about multiple consciousness as jurisprudential method, and I found that was a really key tool to have the conversation about identity and have it linked to legal analysis and legal practice, and set the stage that that's how we're going to be talking about the issue throughout.
Hi. So I also raised the issue in the first class, usually by starting the class, my clinic class, or even actually my first year public interest classes, with the James Baldwin quote that I put up on the board. It's one of the famous ones that many of you may have heard. It says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." And I sort of have the students walk into the room with that. And I sort of set the tone very early in the first class, and specifically with my clinic, which I think the size allows for that sort of intimacy of conversation. We start the class where I model and introduce myself, talk about my own varied background. Of course, do an introduction, much like Mary suggested, that addresses some of the same things that she mentioned. What I also add, though, is because I'm constantly trying to find ways to include students that I feel like who may not have I don't know, the variety of background that, they feel like warrants them talking about their identity. And we talk a lot about, did you go to private school? Did you go to public school? What was your housing situation like? We talk, because it's a criminal justice related class, we talk about your sense of safety. Who made you feel safe? Did police make you feel safe? Did they not make you feel safe? And then I put out there very early on, and I put it actually, these are the bullet points that I put up on the board, is I asked students to talk about their bias. And, we all come in with our bias and the bias that you're aware of. So I have a bias about the criminal justice system. I share my bias. We go around the class and we talk about that. And then this is probably the thing that I think is the most important, which is, something that is ongoing and very difficult to do. But I spend a lot of time talking to them about having a code of trust in the class, and it's sort of, which really is a circle of trust, and something that is very important for us to have these hard conversations, particularly around race and other issues connected to race, because of sort of the volatile nature of the subject. And when I say to them that this includes trust, I tell them that this includes social media, includes you talking to your friends outside the class, people in your own family, and that if I were to hear that that were to ever happen, or any one of us were to hear that that would happen, that would sort of really violate the trust, and it would keep our conversations very superficial. And if they took my class because they wanted to dig deep and they wanted to get into the hard issues, that they owe me that trust and I owe them that trust. And I spent a lot of time talking about that. I also acknowledge that this is a difficult topic, that none of us are experts, that I'm also not an expert, that I'm constantly learning different ways to do this. And this was particularly salient in the fall when my clinic, around the Kavanaugh hearings, because we were also simultaneously working on issues related to gender and pregnant teen youth in detention facilities. And we were having to talk a lot about reproductive rights, and some students were having a hard time in class juxtaposing those two issues. And so I had to push and be delicate, and probably sometimes I pushed too hard, and we had to have conversations about that. But I kept saying to them, there's no playbook on how to do this. We are all sort of learning as we go. And then the last thing I also talked to them about is how this trust is kind of an ongoing relationship. So I make sure to let the students know early on, especially if I see reluctance in that first class, that, I'm here for office hours, we have case reviews. And what I find the most important is I require a reflection after the first class of how the first class went. So a private reflection that they send to me, so I can get a sense of who's sort of dialed in, who's not dialed in. So I spend a lot of time the first couple classes really trying to build that community. And I have found when I've been able to do that, if I have the right group of students, which is almost always, that these issues I feel much more confident and comfortable talking about these issues. So I sort of encourage that, and again, happy to take questions in Q&A to talk about that further.
Great. So next we wanted to dive into sorry, I'm hearing it. Is it better?
Yes.
Okay. We wanted to dive into some examples from our practice. So I wanted to share an example from our practicum course where we had, is it still up? Thank you. Jyoti, do you want to start? And oh, great. The echoing, I think, just stopped. Okay, thanks. So I wanted to share an example from our course where we provided, where we created a reflection space to start talking about these issues. So this is actually an example from the supervision space that's just private with 2 students that are working on a case. We represent immigrant victims of crime, and so our students are doing interviewing, and we have them tape the first interview so that we can supervise and offer them feedback. And 2 of our students were working with a client who was a middle-aged Latina woman who had suffered from domestic violence and sexual assault. And when I watched the interview of their conversation with her, I saw 2 students who were really nervous and who were trying to come up with questions, trying to figure out the dynamic between the two of them, so they were both participating and really listening to her as well. And they wanted to build up rapport before talking about the really traumatic incident that was the crime. And so they were asking questions around that, asking questions about her family. And I also saw a client who was really nervous, who had met some, young students that she's, putting her visa application in the hands of, and she was nervous as well. And they had a line of questions about the family that asked some questions that I saw the client had a reaction to. One example of these sorts of questions was, are all of your children from the same man? And after this question was asked, and then honestly for the rest of the interview, there starts to be a little bit of this dynamic where the client is feeling judged, and she talks about how she thinks it's so important for young immigrant women who have more recently arrived in the United States to stay in school, to not have boyfriends, to not be creating families at a young age. She starts talking about these issues. So I saw this and saw that they had not noticed it. And I tried to raise it with them first by just asking about this section and sort of, how are you feeling about this? When they couldn't exactly see it, because obviously it's much easier when you're watching other people do the interview, I asked us to reflect together on what are the stereotypes that she is used to hearing about herself or her identity or her community. And that's when students started to have the conversation about the idea that having children from different men reflected poorly on her morals, or would have some sort of moral judgment with her. And the students then started to rethink the rest of the conversation and see the parts of the conversation where this had come out, where she had started to try to show that that's not who she is, and that's not how she wanted to be seen. One of the students actually said that she saw within her own community some of these values, and reflected that if she were speaking to an elder in her family, that she would be worried about this sort of perception. And the other student was really quite shocked. She had an experience of working with domestic violence victims, and so saw herself as very trained in this area, and certainly didn't have any negative judgment on the client, but had been unaware of the way the questions were asked and how that would create this perception for the client. And so it was a difficult conversation. We did reflection papers later as well. We think reflection papers have been super helpful at getting at people's processing. And the woman who asked that question said that the supervision meeting had been a little bit uncomfortable for her to talk about these issues. But she also said that this was the most valuable experience of the semester. And she, from this point on, would raise it in case rounds, talking to other students about it, about how these issues can come up, and how, even if she doesn't have the judgment, she needed to be more sensitive to all of the stereotypes that could be at play, because she was younger, because the student asking the question was white, because of the backgrounds that they brought to this conversation. So it really was a very rewarding experience to see her reflecting that was a positive learning moment for her, but it also was an awkward and uncomfortable conversation at times that I'm glad that we had.
I also have a couple of examples. One that I'm sure many of you may have experienced, which is that oftentimes my clinic students do not reflect the clients that they serve, both in terms of race, demographics. And so that's something that I name very early on. When we visit the detention facility, which is very early in the clinic, we spend some time afterwards talking about how that felt, because the majority in Los Angeles County, 99% of the children that are in detention are Black, African American, Latinx. And not often do my clinic students reflect that population. We talk about that. In the event that it does, we also talk about how it makes those lawyers feel to see people who look like them on the other side of the table. We talk about whether we think that impacts the way they can connect with the young person or with the client. I usually name that, and we talk about that, and I give my own experiences of how sometimes when I have clients who look like me, it actually works to my advantage. Sometimes it actually works to my disadvantage because there's sort of a worry about community and trust and expectation. So we sort of really openly talk about the experiences of us in the facility in front of the client, and by virtue of how they look and we look, what sort of that impacts. And I think just naming it is something that I think has been really valuable to me. I think early in my teaching, I didn't want to name it. I didn't know really how to address it because it's such a systemic issue, the lack of diversity in law schools, let alone clinics. But now that I felt comfortable naming it, I feel like it's opened up a lot of conversations with students. So that's something that I do. I have another related story to that, which is that last year we had a couple of years ago, we had a client who showed up with a parental figure in a courthouse, and the public defender came up to us and said to my law student, "I'm really frustrated. Take my phone, go down and talk to the parent and the child. They're not telling me where they live. They can't figure it out. Go take Google, figure it out." So my student runs downstairs and talks to the guardian and the child, and comes back and says to me, "Professor Nanda, they're homeless, and that's why they weren't giving the address to the defender. They felt like the defender was judging them." So I went downstairs. The child was not engaging, not interested, had his hoodie over his head and was bent down. And out of a series of conversations, I was able to open him up and learn sort of the tragedy that he was sort of going through, and that was his aunt who was also homeless. But what what that case ended up really allowing us to do as a class was to sort of unpack the layer upon layer upon layer of judgment that was being placed from every person who interacted with this family, and sort of how, as a result of that, the family was responding to us. So what I said to my student was that I think that the aunt was embarrassed as somebody probably similar age who also has a child. I have a child, and I had admitted that I had a son about the client's age, and that she was sort of embarrassed that she wasn't able to provide for her nephew. So she was reluctant to tell me, whereas the young person was able to connect with me, and we sort of vice versa with the student. And I use it as a teaching example to sort of say, like, our ability to connect with others is definitely based on race and based on our own background, but it is sort of more to that, and that judgment, I mean, we have the explicit bias and implicit bias studies, and many of my colleagues at UCLA have pioneered those, and those are really important. But I really want to talk about how in that moment that really sort of plays out. So I try to use really concrete examples to do that. Two or three others that come to mind that allowed me an opportunity to really unpack was, again, I had a situation where I had asked the student lawyer to go to meet a young person at his job, which happened to be at the Jack in the Box in South LA. It was a white male student, and usually we work in teams and partners, and I try to go with the students whenever I can, but this was a circumstance where I wasn't able to go. In reflection in front of the class, he very bravely shared with all of us that he felt very uncomfortable being the only white person in the Jack in the Box in that entire neighborhood, and that he would have preferred if I had thought through that a little bit or had prepared him in better ways. And I still am so grateful for that conversation that we had, because it allowed me to really think about the experiences and how to think about how to talk about those experiences and what to do further. But I think, again, naming these or sort of having some examples for students of times when students or you felt uncomfortable, or I tell them when I feel uncomfortable, allows for students to kind of really surface these issues and talk about what does that mean for them? What does that mean for the client? And then, the last thing I'll say about this issue is that I try really hard, as I'm sure many of us do, to think about not just individual interactions as it relates to race and how it impacts our clients day to day, but systemic forms of oppression and racial injustice. And I think it's hard to sort of sometimes do both. And I can see sometimes frustration in my students when we are talking individually about the client and the dynamic between, the lawyer and the client and client-centered lawyering, without sort of acknowledging the systemic issues that are also at play. And so I think I try really hard, at least in my syllabus, to sort of do a combination. But I think that is something that also is really important to having this conversation, that we have to sort of take it out of just the individual client-lawyer relationship.
So next I wanted to share examples from the internship at Now CRJ that I've been a part of running. I last summer was the only attorney, a white attorney, supervising 4 young women of color. And out of my discomfort with that arrangement and awareness of the issues that could bring, I started looking around for literature and also designed a little bit of curriculum for the summers to surface these issues and have a space to talk about any issues that would come up. So I found that while there's not very much literature in the legal field on the specific dynamics of cross-racial supervision, there is a fair amount of study of this within social work, and I found that it was very useful to look at this and see what those studies found. So this study, this article reviews a variety of different studies and finds that when supervisors openly discuss race and culture with students, all students reported greater satisfaction. The white students reported less fear in discussing the issues. I think that gets at, sort of what we're talking about the shame and fear of judgment and how hard and sensitive these issues are, and how, and also how kind of confronting them can really lessen that shame and start to break the ice with students. And students of color reported feeling a sense of validation from the conversation. Because as Jyoti was saying, the issue is there, and so we have to confront it and have a vocabulary to talk about it together, so we can together figure out how to resolve some of the issues that will come up. Also talking about the issue increased trust and willingness to discuss these issues in the client relationships. When we talk about them in the supervisory relationship, that creates a model for talking about them with clients. The study also found that white supervisors tended to talk less about race and culture than supervisors of color, and that I found this very interesting, that white supervisors talk about race and culture with white students less than with students of color. I think that points to a gap in how we sometimes think about race as only as not seeing white folks as racial beings and really looking at all racial identity. The study also found that a high degree of racial identity, and racial identity is your awareness, how you feel and perceive race, your own race and others' race. A high degree of racial identity for supervisors increased agreement on tasks, goals, and emotional connection, regardless of the supervisor or student racial identity. So this was a great tool that I used to prompt a conversation with the students about what dynamics could come up in our supervisory relationship, and also this also helped me just educate myself that even as a white supervisor, I needed to have the conversation and talk about my identity rather than it just being the elephant in the room.
We wanted now to turn to sort of, I think some of the sort of meta, bigger picture questions that I think we all confront when we want to think about how we talk about this conversation and talk about this issue specifically. I wanted to sort of raise these, and specifically given sort of the various roles that I've played at UCLA, different statuses throughout my time here in different capacities. And I wanted to sort of name that for all of you listening, that I do think that how you talk about these issues and what you do to think about these issues depends on your law school environment. It depends on your status. And there's different ways to sort of think about it. I think the most important thing, though, to ask yourself first is really, what is your goal? What is your goal when you want to sort of address this issue about race or racial justice or racial injustice? What is your goal to sort of introduce it as it relates to your cases specifically? Are you interested in talking about systems? Are you interested in talking about lawyer-client relationship? Are you wanting to talk about the client's lives, your life, as it relates to that, the students' lives? Because I think that those are all, each of those are lofty goals, and it's impossible to do all of those in a 13-week or even in a year-long clinic. So I think sort of asking yourself, what are my goals, is really important. And then, thinking about these questions, like, do you bring in an outside expert? What are sort of the pros and cons of bringing in an outside expert? Can you trust the person to say sort of, or are you sort of punting? I know sometimes students feel like when we bring in outside experts, it's because we don't have the ability to sort of address those issues. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I think naming that you're bringing somebody in, inviting somebody who can help us have these conversations. This last few years, I've had social work students in my class, which has been an amazing asset to me and to the law students. As a result, I've invited social work professors to come in and teach and talk about lawyer-client relationship, social work-client relationship, because I think in many ways their training is much more holistic than the training that we traditionally give in law school. So I would say to my students, I'm bringing in people who I think are better at reflecting, better at acknowledging student difference and client difference, and bring that person in. I also think it's important to think about, what is your law school environment? Do you have a team of people that can support you? How do you sort of create a learning space for yourself as a clinician or as a faculty member where it's okay to make mistakes? Do you sort of have the support of people around you? And are you sort of yourself willing to respond to criticism, both whether you get it from students or whether you get it from your colleagues? Because again, all of us are differently situated in our universities. All of us have different concerns about our own viability within the clinical space. And I think that it's important to sort of name that and be kind to yourself, given sort of your status, and know that sort of it's important to have a space to talk about these issues, but you also have to have a community of people to talk to about this. And again, because I've been in various different capacities at UCLA, these are conversations that I've had have had to think about for the last 16 years.
Yeah, I just want to add on to the point that it's likely that this is in all aspects of teaching. You will get criticism either from students that find that you insufficiently address the issue or that you emphasize the issue too much. I have also experienced that from both sides. I've had students of color who were dissatisfied with me, with the way that I was trying to hold a space to reflect on something that they were experiencing. But I have always also seen it as a huge vote of confidence in me as an instructor, as well as a lawyer or like colleague in the movement. When students come to me directly with these thoughts, I have had students say that they need additional space to talk about this, and I think that opening in the first class or opening in the framing can create at least that space where students can come to you with it, because we know that students are thinking about it right now. We know that students are very attentive to these dynamics. And also I'm not perfect. I'm absolutely making mistakes in the way that I'm trying to move through this. But I'm very conscious to be open about that, and try to have the conversation with students in a humble and open way, so that we can sort of struggle through the issues together and build a reflective practice.
And I just wanted to add to that, as a clinician of color, I was from multiple marginal identities. I sometimes think it's also challenging for those of us that are faculty of color, because I had an incident this last few years where I've been trying increasingly to include students in my juvenile justice clinic who are prosecutorial minded, which then tends to sometimes create dynamics in the classroom that are very challenging. But I was really trying to do my best to sort of be much more inclusive. I thought it would really help the pedagogy of the clinic space. And I would get critique particularly from some students of color, particularly progressive, social justice, community-minded students who would say to me that they felt like I was holding back on my opinions about these topics, and that they felt like I was sort of watering them down in order to create this inclusive environment. And so, I had to have very honest conversations with them about my intentionality behind that. But to Mary's point, I felt like at least the students were coming to me to sort of talk about it. We were engaging about it. I didn't necessarily always have solutions, because I had made sort of a pedagogical decision to do that, and I still felt like it was the right one to include everybody. But I appreciated that they said to me that, I really want a space where I can be pushed and you are sort of hesitating now because in your attempt to sort of be inclusive. So it was really something that I also had to reflect on as well. Now here we're gonna, this is sort of, we're winding down the PowerPoint part of our presentation, and we thought we have the next few slides are actually a list of resources that are by no means intended to be inclusive of everything that we know exists. It's just things that we've collected over time, largely from prior AA-less clinical conferences. But I think a lot about teaching tools in terms of buckets and how I can sort of add to these different buckets. So these are the buckets that we came up with, and I'm going to opine about a few of these and then have Mary talk about which ones she's used. The readings is obvious. In terms of thinking about how to do this, we've already talked about case law. Of course, there's a variety of law review articles. Of course, there's policy, lots of policy reports that in your respective areas. We have some of those in the resources slides that are coming in a few minutes. I'm increasingly trying to find ways to engage my students in this topic by using, movies and podcasts. I constantly ask my students to send me podcasts. A lot of times I find that even if they listen to radio shows, there's a different way in which they process the information, multi-mode, learning, different ways to learn. I really believe in immersion. And what I mean by immersion is very early take my students to detention facilities. Very early we visit housing projects where a lot of our clients come from. I find that there's we visit the schools, so they get to see the metal detectors. And I find that there's really no amount of reading or books or anything that can sort of replace the physical experience of doing that. And again, being in LA, I have the luxury of having a lot of those things nearby. So that's something. Obviously, dialogue. One thing that some of my colleagues at the law school are experimenting with is blogs, where students you have a private blog just for your clinic that allows students to communicate with each other through our web-based interface system. I've heard sort of mixed things about the use of it, but overall, pretty high student satisfaction, because they get to talk to each other in the ways that they tend to communicate nowadays, which is really sort of online. And it allows the professor to sort of monitor that. Obviously, there's huge concerns about confidentiality there. So that is something that has to, I think, be thought about. Obviously, guest lectures, I find reflections, as we've said already, to be really, really important, particularly written ones. I found that I learned probably the most about how people are feeling about this issue, and it really informs my teaching. When I get really thoughtful reflection papers, I usually pose very hard questions. I make them required. I'm sort of a stickler for them, but I find that it's my way of really engaging the students. And again, this, of course, is as the class sizes get bigger, this gives me a chance to sort of interact. And then, of course, I'll let Mary speak to supervision and clinic rounds, which I know many of us do.
Yeah, I think it's just, sorry. I think it's important that we forefront it at the beginning of the class, and then we do raise it in supervision as it comes up. And we also really invite students to raise it. I think there's a few different ways we can do that. Like I was mentioning in the example before, we can reflect on what stereotypes our client might be worried about, or what judgments our client might be worried about in terms of how we tell their story and how we interact with them. We also think about this through another helpful frame in raising it in supervision can be considering it through the adjudicator's lens. We're filing U-Visa applications. We don't know the individual adjudicator who would review the application. So we can use the perspective of, think if a person of color, a race-conscious person were to review this application, that can be a way to make sure that in our writing and in our storytelling that we're not evoking stereotypes, and can be a way to have the conversation more openly, where we're not saying that any student is trying to invoke a stereotype or anything like that, just that we need to be extra conscious in our practice for the client and for the story to be compelling. I think that we also have, I think another helpful thing that we do on this point is that we don't do a guest lecture for a class that we do specifically focused on race, which we're going to talk about right after this. We also do a guest lecture on vicarious trauma, and I think that's another really helpful lens to have a social worker or another practitioner to share an analysis of trauma to understand in individual client interactions, as well as in the larger sense, what is going on here and what are the effects of the stereotypes and bias and structural barriers as well, so that we're thinking about it holistically. And I would also say we try in all of our materials on lawyering skills, including interviewing, theory of the case, all of those different components are legal writing materials. We try to draw on materials that will talk about these sort of justice concerns. If we're using, for instance, Amsterdam or some of the other sort of canonical pieces on theory of the case, we specifically have conversations about what are the master plots out there that could be evoking stereotypes of our clients. And in that storytelling piece, we have been using a piece that specifically addresses race. I use a clip from Hassan Minhaj's Homecoming, where he's telling a story from childhood that is about racial discrimination that he experienced, and it showcases a lot of the important storytelling elements while also really making the story very poignant on the point of racial discrimination, which I think is also the same sort of like storytelling we're trying to get our students to work on. And of course, we're gonna share the list of resources we have here at the end. We just have a few more slides. So next we wanted to talk about, for those of you that might have the opportunity to have a specific seminar class talking about this issue, I think it's a really key opportunity. Some tools that we've done, we also use reflection papers in advance. I think that's really key on this issue so that you get people sharing in a confidential space as well, and then you can try to prompt similar reflections in the group, but you do need to sort of assess where the group is at to know what areas to emphasize. In that class, we also go over shared vocabulary because we found that can be a big barrier to talking about these issues, is that students, some students know a lot of the vocabulary around this issue, like microaggression and anti-Blackness and tokenizing, and other students may be very new to these concepts. So we go through the list of vocabulary and also try to use that to prompt conversations where students can bring examples of things they've seen or experienced as a way to try to get people really talking about this. We have readings as well, of course, to prompt, and we'll have some examples of those. I think also for me, I think the most important thing for leading a seminar class on this topic is to open the class with a recognition of how difficult it is to have these conversations, and to try to be a little bit vulnerable, even as a teacher, to share. I try to share examples of how I feel like I try to remain present to when defensiveness and like white privilege are coming up for me, and how I try to respond in those moments to just recognize and name for everyone that this is happening for me, and try to create some space then so other people can share as well. I think having that humility and sharing that, you know, I make mistakes. I have some of that white guilt, and I know when it's triggered in me, and I try and sharing what I do to try to make sure that isn't doing harm to my work or to the people around me, can be a way to try to draw people out so that they can share and try to counteract some of the shame or embarrassment that students have around this.
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge I'm getting a few questions, and we're going to get to Q&A in a few minutes. So I just wanted to let people know that I do see your questions that we'll get to in a few minutes when we talk about resources. I don't think I have anything to add here that I haven't already shared. We have a list of vocabulary. By no means is it inclusive of all the words that we think are important to address when talking about this issue. And again, these might change depending on where you are in the country and what sort of is the task that you're about to take. But one thing I wanted to just point out here is that I try really hard to also make sure that we include, more controversial statements. I mean, we have Me Too, and then I also talked about Men Too, which was the counterpart to the Me Too movement that also started. We talk a lot about, we talk about white fragility, but also white privilege, Black Lives Matter. I also spend time talking about in class about all lives matter and sort of the counterpoint to that, because I feel like my job as an academic or as a teacher is really to create an atmosphere where we can engage really in these issues that are hard, and it doesn't mean sort of an echo chamber, which can be really challenging sometimes to do it, but I spend a lot of time thinking about that. I required in my public interest classes and even in my clinic for students to watch alternative, more conservative news or opposition news to what is their viewpoint. And so I would require students to watch, whether it be Fox News or whatever the counter viewpoint is, about their specific issue that we were addressing in the clinic, just so that they could have a better understanding of how to respond to that. And I find that in order to talk about these issues, you really have to try to get a sense of an understanding of why people are so afraid of, for example, Black Lives Matter, and why they feel like all lives matter is a counterpoint to that, why people were so afraid of Me Too, and why they felt like Men Too was important. So my philosophy has always been to sort of engage in all of it, if possible, to encourage sort of dialogue and conversation.
I think now we're going to open it up for questions that many folks have been writing in.
I got a question that I'm going to pose, and then Mary, you and I can sort of opine about it. So one of the questions was, how have we addressed bias that we have felt as clinicians from students that might have felt that what we were saying to them was inferior, not as sufficient to maybe ones that they're getting from, the question was posed to me as sort of a white male colleague, and how do you sort of address that issue? So I don't know if you wanted to respond to that.
You can start this.
Yeah, I mean, I say the first thing to do is to take a deep breath, because it happens a lot and will probably continue to happen. It happens to me, and will probably continue to happen. But that I spend, in the moment, it's difficult to sort of address the racial dynamic that's at play, because you're really sort of trying to address the fact that the student is not responding to your task at hand. And so sometimes you have to put down, that's where you sort of be the supervisor and be the supervising lawyer and sort of say that I'm sort of tasking you to do this. But I always make sure that if not in that moment, that I then have a private conversation with the student about it afterwards. Usually, and sometimes if I feel like the student is confronting me in front of other students, I'll say, in the moment, I really want you to come see me after class. I sense some tension in the way this dialogue is happening, and I want us to sort of have a conversation about it. I find that is really the way to address it head on, while acknowledging to the other students in the room, if they are there, that you're seeing that this is happening, that you're addressing it. Sometimes in those moments, I've had students who were witnessing it come talk to me afterwards because they felt uncomfortable. And if anything, it's sort of opened up a dialogue. The key here, though, of course, is if there's trust between the student and the professor, it can go so much better. But I think that those moments are going to continue to happen. I think female faculty of color, we might face those at higher rates. Sort of the pushback from students at what we're saying to them is not as valid. I think that those are really real. And that's where it goes back to having a community as clinicians and faculty to talk to sort of brainstorm and address. I mean, if you have that, it is just such a gold mine, because you're able to go back to people and say, this was a scenario that came up. What should I do? How should I address it? What have you done? And I think that we need as clinicians to really have that community and really build that. And some of us have had that, some of us have not, some of us have found it in other spaces, but I feel like it's been critical. Did you want to add anything to that, Mary?
I guess I would just say that I certainly have had the experience that the feedback is not received well in the moment, and years later, I think it does sometimes sink in. So absolutely everything that Jyoti's saying about, trying to react in the moment. But I do think some of these, I think that everyone can be ready for these conversations, but certainly some students could be more resistant than others. And I have had pushback, but I think it's still been really valuable, and that students might appreciate it later when they have more experiences out in the field and working with different people, reflecting back on having been given really that opportunity from what you've been saying to them.
Okay, we have another great question here. Do we have an application process for classes where you start on day one with community trust building and sharing vulnerable stories, or reflection journal in advance of the first class? How do you start these topics during the add drop period, 1 to 2 weeks at the start of the semester? Those are all really good questions. So it depends on the nature of the class. When I taught my problem solving and public interest class, introduction to public interest class, those are classes where students couldn't add or drop. So for those classes, I actually required students do a pre-write for the first day of class with a lot of questions about them, their background, where they had been in terms of their work experience, so that it would help me hit the ground running on the first day to sort of design the class. So if I know it's going to be a class where I'm not going to lose students or have to add students, then you can do a pre-write on the front end, which I actually think allows you to jumpstart from day one. Oftentimes, if that isn't going to happen, then I will wait till the second class, but usually no later than the second class to do that. And it does mean sometimes you get a couple people coming in and out, but I think that writing piece early on is very, very important. I have them write pre-write before the first class, and I also will pre-write and share with them so that we sort of start the conversation. And then if that is not possible, if it's a larger class, like some of the larger classes that I've taught, we usually do it at the end of the first class. But again, I think the importance there, and really it's the responsibility of the faculty members. I try really hard to read all those reflection papers and respond in some fashion. And it was challenging when we did the introduction to lawyer-client relationship class. It was a class of 150 students, but I thought it was really important to sort of say to them, I hear you, I've heard what you've had to say, and I'm acknowledging that we're trying to build this trust.
We have an application process for ours, but I would just add, we tend to prefer doing reflection papers in advance, exactly so you could read over and sort of inform your teaching. There are times on this issue where we'll do a free write, just asking students to write in the class as well. So I think that can be a substitute, but it can be really valuable to have that confidential space of a reflection paper that's emailed just to you if it is an option in your clinic format. I know everyone's different.
Yeah, it looks like we don't have a slew of questions coming, so maybe Mary and I did such a good job. We don't have any questions, but I don't know if there's anything else, Mary, you wanted to add. We have about 7 minutes left, I think.
Great. I think we could, I'm going to go to the slides on the resources, and I think it'd be helpful to go over them.
I can tell you that when I was trying to figure out for my Introduction to Lawyer-Client Relationship class, which was eventually rolled out to all 370 first-year law students at UCLA Law, what we found over time that was most useful was having students watch The Danger of a Single Story TED Talk, a DJ's TED Talk that I'm sure many of you have seen. She has since had a couple of books that have come out since this particular TED Talk that are also brilliant. But I found that what we did was we'd show it in a large form setting, and we did it a number of ways. We showed it to all 100 students and then had them, when they went into their smaller group classes, reflect on it, which went okay, but it was then challenging for the professors to facilitate that conversation. What I did this last year that I thought worked pretty well was I had students watch it on their own and then write a reflection paper, and then we talked about it in class. I found that we got to sort of another layer, another depth, and that also allowed for students that maybe didn't feel comfortable in the group setting to talk about their reflections, but to do it in the reflection paper. And then it allowed for students who wanted to sort of verbalize and talk about it in the class. And that way we didn't spend like class time necessarily just watching this TED Talk together. Although I've done it in other classes where watching it together is also really powerful, just because the messaging is so powerful. So I just wanted to really flag that. I mean, everything on here is amazing and useful. But I found that what's beautiful about that TED Talk is that it prompts conversations from people that you wouldn't otherwise hear from. So I just wanted to flag that one in particular.
Yeah, I'd like to flag just at the top that People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. This is an organization based in New Orleans that does undoing racism trainings across the country, across the world, really. And it's the predominant framework for analyzing race in New Orleans. So it's something that I always recommend to students because it's very important to be educated in this framework for work here. It's a pretty intense, like 3-day training, but I've found that it was very important for me and very important to other folks in the community that have gone through it to just start developing that vocabulary and also have some vulnerable conversations before you, talk about it with students or that sort of thing. So I imagine there's other similar trainings, but I know that this is across the country, so I very much would recommend folks participating in it. We got a question. The question is, how much devil's advocating do you do in class? I find that some students think my class takes a certain tone that can turn into a lefty echo chamber. And this year I'd like to include more opportunities to explore the other side of issues like housing and education. I think this is a really great question. I'm trying to think from my experience in immigration right now, it's a little limited. Jyoti, do you have examples you want to start off with?
Yeah, I mean, I play a lot of devil's advocate in my class. Again, going back to the point of where I require that the students watch or read alternative news sources as part of what an assignment is for class. So they have to come to me with the alternative argument to their argument that they're making. So that's, oftentimes it's just telling them, I need you to watch Fox News tonight, and I need you to pick an issue, and you need to come and debate it, and we're going to debate it. I've done debates in larger classes where I've had students take positions that they feel uncomfortable with. In my crim law class this year, I actually simulated a plea deal where you had a prosecutor and a public defender, and I actually picked students that I, who I didn't think would want to be a public defender, who I didn't think would want to be a prosecutor, and give them positions and bargaining chips that they had to sort of bargain from. And so I find that the role playing, if I'm able to do it well with a little bit of prep, really allows students to sort of push on these issues. I am constantly playing devil's advocate. And I feel like increasingly as, again, the climate that we're in continues to be harder and harder to teach these topics, I find it's even more important that we do that, because I also find a lot of salvage and refuge in an echo chamber, but I'm finding that it's really important not to do that. So I spend a lot of time and a lot of thought in thinking about how to do that.
I would say in our course, this mostly comes up in individual supervision meetings. We're trying to for instance, deal with an unfavorable criminal record. And it's often the case in these immigration applications that we need to have the client accept responsibility for something that was probably based on an unjust arrest, or there's more details to the story. So this can be a key issue that we sort of role play out with students, and talk about how to have conversations with clients and how to figure out how to frame this issue, even when our students are completely on our client's side and want to sort of fully relitigate a criminal history. I think that can be a good lesson in sort of seeing things from the adjudicator's point of view and pushing them on that. We also, even though for the types of applications that we're doing, there's no court proceeding or no oral argument, we did start adding an oral argument session where we bring in outside sort of judges to ask our students tough questions. And I think those are also immigration practitioners, so folks who are also advocating for immigrants. And so it can be good to make sure they understand that we're doing all of that to, to really create the strongest analysis possible overall, and trying to push them to view things from all points of view.
I'm being told that we need to wrap this up, but I have this one question that I'm just going to say yes to, because I know Mary's going to say yes to this too. It says, do you ever include discussions of all the isms with the discussion of racism? And the answer is an astounding yes. This purpose of this webinar was really to focus on the issue of race, but I think it's really important to say that all of the sort of the isms or the differences are equally important, and you sort of can't talk, you can't talk about one without the other, hence intersectionality. And I just have to sort of, because I'm at UCLA, acknowledge sort of the CRS scholars and my colleagues here who have thought and written about this extensively. So I just wanted to make sure we got that question.
Yeah, there's additional resources here. I think another point that I know, Jyoti's always emphasizing is really like starting from history can be a really powerful tool in each of our practice areas. So here are some additional resources that, depending on your practice area, could be helpful and contain some of that really strong historical analysis. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for being with us, and we will circulate information on the recording, and stay tuned for our next series, hopefully in the next couple of months. Thanks again.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Be well. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.